You know that part in Samin Nosrat's Salt, Fat, Acid hit series where she makes the most sexy, mouth-watering pasta in Tuscany? That's what we're making today. We will leave no stone unturned and answer all those persistent pasta questions. Is 00 flour really better than all-purpose? Should you salt your pasta dough? Or should you salt the water? Or should you salt both? And why? Should you use a food processor or the well method? Should you roll with a machine or a rolling pin? And what's the best way to store pasta after making it? When people tell me about their first attempt at fresh pasta, they usually describe a disaster. Basically, 3 hours wasted to produce pasta that's worse than the dry stuff sold in a box. That's what my first attempt felt like too. And today, we'll talk about all those rookie mistakes and how to prevent them. The first mistake is choosing a pasta instructor based on their personality or their Italian heritage. I know they make it look easy and so fun. The problem is that they are trying to teach you to make pasta the way they learned to make pasta, by touch and feel. Think of these chefs as native speakers of pasta. Just like native speakers of a language don't need to think about grammar and vocabulary, these chefs don't need to think about measurements. They can adjust as they go. Intuitive pasta making is not for people learning from books and screens. Unless you have an Italian grandma or experienced pasta chef hiding in your closet somewhere, think of yourself as a foreign language speaker of pasta. You need a lot of details and accurate measurements if you want to make quick progress. First, let's talk about the flour. You might have heard that in Italy, pasta is made with 00 flour, and if you want the real deal, you should buy 00. Well, actually, I've been making pasta out of King Arthur unbleached all-purpose flour for years. But last year, I wanted to try 00 to see what the hype was all about. There was only one problem. I quickly realized that there were many 00 flours out there. What does 00 even mean? I did a little research. In other words, I Googled, and here's what I've learned. In the US, we differentiate between flours based on their protein content. Cake flour has very little protein, bread flour has a lot of protein, and all-purpose flour is in the middle. But 00 has nothing to do with protein. It has to do with the grind. The finer the grind, the more zeros. 00 flour is very powdery. It is ground more finely than American flour, but you could have a 00 cake flour, a 00 bread flour, and a 00 all-purpose flour. Just like not all American flour makes the best chocolate chip cookies, not all 00 Italian flour makes the best pasta. So I thought if I'm going to seek out a specialty flour, I might as well get the right one. The one that's intended for pasta use. I bought it on Amazon, and that's what I did my experiments on. The protein content of this flour is 11.5 to 12.5%, which is somewhere between King Arthur all-purpose and bread flour. So, was it worth it? Yes, it was. Pasta made with King Arthur all-purpose flour is either firm or soft, depending on how long you cook it. It doesn't have that chewy state that you get with 00, where the dough gradually yields to your teeth. 00 flour is a lot more expensive than all-purpose, so if you don't want to splurge on it until you get the basic technique down, that's totally understandable. But at some point, definitely give it a shot. The second biggest mistake of rookie pasta makers is sloppy measurements.
Pasta is never the same twice,
And you know why? Because flour is a powder and it's compressible, so measuring it with cups is insanely inaccurate. The eggs are different too. Weighing large eggs in their shells, I found some as small as 54 grams and as big as 70 grams. I know Samin was shooting for an easy-to-remember formula of 1 cup of flour, 1 egg, and 1 yolk, but pasta formula is not a pin on your luggage combination lock. It doesn't need to be memorable. It needs to be reliable and reproducible. So here's what actually works. 300 grams of flour, 285 grams of wet ingredients. Here's how to get the wet ingredients. Start with 2 large eggs, then add 3 large yolks, then add enough water to get to 185 grams. Is it possible that you'll reach 185 grams with eggs alone? Very unlikely. Maybe if you're using jumbo eggs or something. In that case, whisk them all together and pour a little bit out until you get to 185 grams. Yes, humidity and environmental factors make a small difference too, but weighing all your ingredients will put you very close to your target, and I'll show you how to make that final adjustment if necessary. So we've got flour, we've got eggs. What about salt? In her book, Samin suggests that adding salt to the pasta dough will make it firmer and harder to knead. I've tested this theory and found no difference in the dough texture with salt versus without salt. But what about the flavor? Before the pasta ends up in your mouth, it needs to be very thoroughly salted. How you get that salt in there is actually up to you. I prefer to add 2 teaspoons of Diamond Crystal Kosher salt to the dough, or 1 teaspoon of table salt. Please don't use Morton's Kosher for this. It doesn't dissolve well. If you use this amount of salt in the dough, you still need to salt the water a lot, but not an absolutely insane amount. Samin's salt-free dough requires a really insane amount of salt in the water, which makes it too dangerous to use for thinning out the sauce. You can easily make your sauce too salty. Nikki from SeriousSeeds.com came to the same conclusion about salt in her pasta testing. I think it's comforting when you can recreate someone else's results. It's a thankless job, both in science and in cooking, but someone's got to do it. Okay, we've got our ingredients. Let's make the dough. Put the flour and salt into the food processor and buzz them to combine. Add the eggs and water and spin things around until you get a dough. Yes, you could have done it by hand, but this is way faster. If you don't have a food processor and want the details on the well method, check out the link below the video. I explained it thoroughly in my water-based dough video several years ago. Get the dough out of the processor and shake out all the flour that got stuck under the blade and all the other bits and pieces. The dough won't be homogeneous at this point, so if you want those measurements to work, you do need to get absolutely everything out of your processor. Work your dough for a minute before making a decision on adjustments. It will feel a bit wet when it first comes out, but in about a minute it will settle down. So don't even think about adding more flour until you've been kneading it for a full minute. During the first minute, your hands will be very sticky, so you might want to rub them really well to get all this dough off and knead those crumbs in. Our dough is doing great, but if it was sticking to the counter after the first minute of kneading, I would knead in about a tablespoon of flour. Wait for it to get completely absorbed and then decide if I need even more flour. Kneading pasta dough is very different from bread dough. Pasta dough is tough. It won't cooperate if you try to fold it all the way in half and rotate 90 degrees on each turn. See? It doesn't want to stick together. Fold just a small amount of dough towards you. Press and rotate the dough slightly. Fold, press, rotate. All the motions are a lot smaller with pasta dough than with bread dough. The goal here is to very gradually wrap the dough around itself, which will develop gluten and elasticity. See how the top looks like a spiral? And the bottom is getting silky smooth. If your dough looks rough underneath, you might be smearing it too hard or grabbing it with your fingers while pressing down on it. You don't want to rip the dough underneath. So when you press down, make sure your fingertips are up. How do you know when your dough is kneaded enough? For bread dough, you can do a window pane test where you stretch it into a very thin membrane. Pasta dough is too firm for that kind of test, so I just go by time. Once my dough is out of the food processor, I set my timer for 8 minutes. The third biggest rookie mistake is insufficient kneading. You can't over-knead pasta dough. So if it's your first time and you have never kneaded anything before in your life, go for 10 minutes of kneading, since it might take you a few minutes to become productive. And no, you can't knead it in a stand mixer. Pasta dough is too tough for machines. When you're done kneading, sprinkle the dough with flour on both sides, wrap tightly in plastic and let it rest for at least 30 minutes at room temperature. This will relax the gluten and prevent the dough from shrinking when you try to get it to that 1 millimeter thickness. If you are not ready to roll after 30 minutes, no worries. Just keep your dough at room temperature until you're ready, as long as you roll it out the same day you make it. Now about the rolling. You have 3 options: KitchenAid attachment, table attachment, and a rolling pin. If you have a KitchenAid mixer, I strongly suggest you buy a pasta rolling attachment. It's way easier to use than the manual table thing. The table attachment tends to wiggle, but you can solve this problem by using the handle as a lever to help you tighten your machine to the table. I've also placed a silicone trivet between the clamp and the table to provide a more sticky surface, but that's optional. Remember to push into the handle as you roll. Otherwise, it can fall out. Yeah, this thing won't get any usability awards. Before we start rolling out the dough, let's prep the work surface to put it on when it's done. There is nothing worse than getting a sheet of beautiful pasta out of the machine and getting it stuck to the counter. I'm using semolina flour because it's great at preventing sticking, but you could use the same flour you used for making the dough. Just to clarify, semolina is only good for storage, not for rolling. For rolling, use all-purpose or 00 and be liberal with it. You want to avoid sticking at all costs. Here is our pasta dough. We're going to divide it into 4 parts. Wrap whichever parts you are not currently working with tightly in plastic to prevent them from drying. Flatten out the dough with your hands or a rolling pin until it's the thickness of a pancake. Set your machine to the first setting and feed the dough through. Fold the dough like a letter, folding it into thirds. Flatten it out, reflour it, and feed it through. Do this process about 4 times until you get close to a rectangle. We're still on the first setting, by the way. We didn't start to thin the dough out yet. If you feel that folding the dough in half will get you closer to the right shape, do that. When you're happy with the shape, you can start to thin out the dough. No, you can't just jump from setting 1 to setting 6. You have to go through each setting. I prefer to do each setting twice because there's always a bit of shrinkage after the first pass. Don't forget to add more flour if the dough feels at all sticky. When you feed the dough through the machine, you should let go of it as soon as it gets caught in the rollers. This frees up your hand to catch the dough as it comes out. And it stretches the dough over the back of the rollers, helping it to thin out. After the 4th or 5th setting, you might want to cut the dough in half, or it will become very long and difficult to handle. The question is, where do we stop? For any filled shapes and most ribbon pasta, I like to stop at 6. Although I do each setting twice, I do the 6th setting only once, otherwise the dough gets too thin. Here's what it looks like on a KitchenAid. Set the mixer to the lowest speed. As soon as the rollers catch my dough, I let it drop to help it stretch and catch it on the other side. For very hearty ribbon pasta, I stop at the 5th setting, with a few caveats. I put it through the 5th setting 3 times, stretching it a bit as it comes out. By the way, the best way to carry pasta dough is on the back of your hands. I'll stretch it out just a bit so that it's not as thin as 6, but not as thick as 5. And last and most difficult way to roll out pasta dough is with a rolling pin. I only suggest you attempt this if you are using 00 pasta flour. All-purpose flour makes it very difficult to roll out your dough thinly enough. The fourth rookie mistake is using American flour and the rolling pin, which is a recipe for trouble. Sprinkle your work surface generously with flour and start rolling. As soon as your dough is more oval this way, rotate it 90 degrees. Be extremely liberal with flour, whatever it takes to avoid sticking. Always roll from the center to the outside. Now it's more oval this way again, so we'll rotate it again. Keep going like this, way past the point that you think is thin enough. Trust me, it's not. I find that it's much easier to roll the pasta with a pin if you have seen how thin it should be on that 6th setting of a machine. Actually, not seen, but more like felt. It's really hard to see the differences between such small thicknesses in a video. You want barely thicker than a sheet of phyllo dough. It should feel like the kind of fabric you want to wear on a very hot and humid summer day. If you don't have a rolling machine and are thinking of making hand shapes like orecchiette or cavatelli, sorry to break it to you, but they won't taste good out of this dough. You need water-based dough for those. Eggs produce much firmer, chewier pasta. The dough we've made today is only tasty if you can get it very thin. The water produces much softer pasta. It's great for rustic, thicker shapes, but doesn't really work for thin sheets. I'll link to my water pasta dough and some hand shapes below if you want to give them a shot. If you're filling the pasta, do so right away while it's still a tad sticky. If you're cutting your pasta into ribbons, let your pasta sheets dry out until they feel like leather. They should still be pliable, but not at all sticky. When the first side feels good, flip it and dry the other side. It will take 15 to 30 minutes depending on humidity of the room. If you don't want to cook your pasta right away, you can stack slightly dry but still pliable sheets between parchment paper, sprinkle them with flour and wrap them tightly in plastic wrap. They'll last just fine in the fridge for 1 to 2 days. I like to cut dough right before it goes into the pot to prevent it from sticking together. If you didn't have time to dry your pasta to the texture of skin, sprinkle it very liberally with semolina. Actually, even if you dried it some, sprinkle it just in case. Roll up your pasta from both directions toward the center and cut with the chef's knife on a cutting board. You can make it as wide or narrow as you like. Stick the dull side of the knife into the crease, like this, and lift it up to unroll. If you're dealing with a very long sheet, cut it in half. Since this one was only rolled to the 5th setting, I'll cut it into more narrow ribbons. You can play around with thickness and widths until you find the one you like. I think the cutting into ribbons is my favorite part of making pasta. Just look at those beautiful ribbons. The last but not least fresh pasta mistake is not getting the salt right. For dry pasta, you need way less salt in the water than for fresh. Fresh pasta cooks in 1 minute, maybe 2 minutes tops. It doesn't get a chance to absorb a ton of water the way dry pasta does. So the water needs to be very salty. The chefs call it like the sea. But in case it's been a while since you swallowed seawater, I'll give you actual measurements. Just realize that we all have our own salt preferences and you might need to adjust to make it perfect for you. For 6.5 quarts of water, I use 65 grams of salt. That's half a cup of Diamond Crystal Kosher salt or a 1/4 cup of table salt. If you have some other salt, I can't help you with the volume. Again, a reminder to be careful with Morton's Kosher. It's closer to table salt than to Diamond Crystal Kosher salt. This amount of salt will produce a very flavorful pasta, assuming you added salt to the dough. If you are sensitive to sodium, use whatever you think is appropriate. And about the pot. A covered pot will come to a boil a lot faster, but a covered pot with salt will boil over unless you catch the right moment to remove the lid. Since I want my water to boil quickly and not to boil over, I add the salt after the water is almost boiling, and after that I wait for the boil without covering the pot. Dump in your pasta, stir, and set the timer for 1 minute. Taste to make sure your pasta is done and get it out. Never drain fresh pasta in a colander. The flour you use to prevent sticking will settle on the bottom of the pot and will not hurt anyone if you just leave it there. But if you dump all this water into the colander, your pasta will be covered with semolina mush. For long ribbon pasta, I start with tongs and then switch to a spider spoon. This slatted spoon has totally changed my life. It holds a lot and drains well. Toss your pasta with the sauce of your choice and a healthy chunk of butter. And obviously the sauce should be hot before you add the pasta. You don't want the pasta to cool off. In case you think that all my precision has taken all the joy out of my pasta, trust me, I am very happy right now. If you were eating this pasta, you'd be very happy right now too. By the way, when I cook in vacation homes, I am perfectly capable of making pasta completely by feel. No scale, no measurement cups, no food processor, and no rolling machine. What do you know? All those years of accuracy didn't destroy my intuition. If anything, they created the intuition. If you want to learn to make ravioli or tortellini, here are some videos for you to check out. Next week, we'll make bolognese sauce to go with our fabulous fresh egg pasta. So don't forget to subscribe, hit that little bell button for notifications, and if you're ever in the Boston area, maybe I'll see you in one of my classes.